This is a particularly important conversation to have today with this group talking about financial advisors because of the concept of being a fiduciary for the people whose money you manage and the people who you recommend financial advice to. That changes the name of the game when we're talking about cybersecurity. And I wonder if both of you could open with some thoughts about what it means to be a fiduciary in a cybersecurity sense of the word. That is, you have a responsibility to protect this information that goes beyond just a typical business's own self-interest in protecting the information. You're responsible for your clients and their information. Brian, why don't we start with you and just give us your sense of how that concept of being a fiduciary changes the game in cybersecurity.
Well, and so what we're seeing is we're seeing a significant increase in the hackers getting access to these retirement assets. And we're also seeing a response from the Department of Labor that came out and said, here's a guide. This is what every firm should be doing to be acting as that fiduciary. I mean, we're out there protecting them on the investment side, but we also have to think about protecting those assets, because if a hacker were able to hack into a retirement account and take those assets, there's nothing left to manage. So the Department of Labor has done an exceptional job in defining two steps. One, they have a guide. That guide is consistent with what every firm needs to do in order to protect their clients. And number two, they say that they give a guidance on how to select a partner in the cybersecurity world.
Greg, Brian mentions the Department of Labor guidelines on this and says they're doing a fantastic job. Do you agree with that, or do you think government needs to do more to lay out really detailed specifics for how you handle cybersecurity in a financial advisory firm?
Well, thank you for having me today. I think it's really, really difficult for the government to get too specific because each firm is a little different depending on their size and the level of maturity. I think they've done a great job of setting a baseline or a foundation. But I think what it's really important for financial advisors to understand is that that's just the foundation, that they really need to inspire to do more, because ultimately that's going to be the standard that they're held to in the event that something goes wrong. And I think oftentimes the thought is to do the absolute minimum. And unfortunately, when something goes wrong, there's significant fines, penalties, and just overall goodwill loss and loss of respect of that firm when something goes wrong. So I think it's incumbent on them to not to take the attitude that I want to do the minimum required, but to really lean into it and do those things that they really need to do to trust the assets that the clients have entrusted them with.
I wonder if there's some real-world examples that you guys can share. And I ask this because it has been a really weird year out there. We're coming off the tail end of the pandemic, at least hopefully the tail end of the pandemic. We also saw the Russia-Ukraine war break out earlier this year. That had an enormous impact on cybersecurity because a lot of the hackers were in Russia and Ukraine, distracted by this conflict, now maybe able to figure out how to resume operations. So I wonder what both of you are seeing out there on the landscape right now for cybersecurity at the end here of 2022. Is this a year where we saw, hacking come back in a big way, Brian?
Oh, without question. We see it all the time. A combination of things that we see. One is a big deal on the corporate, the email hacks, where the bad actors will go into an email account, intercept a conversation with a plan administrator, and make a recommendation for that plan administrator to make a distribution to an account that isn't a normal account that they would distribute to. So it's very important that plan administrators, when they have access to all of the assets of a plan, that they think twice when they're doing something a little bit different. We're also seeing a significant
little bit different
amount
and a little
of
brushing up
attacks
against illegal activity, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's not just different business operations. You're talking about sending funds directly to criminals. That's something that's got to make a lot of CFOs and financial advisory executives just worried, straight up.
We're seeing it, and we're seeing then the FBI comes in, and the first thing the FBI is doing is an investigation, and part of that investigation is to figure out whether or not that firm is negligent in the protections that they have in place that has been defined for them to have in place. There are requirements for these firms in order to protect those assets.
Greg, how would you describe 2022? I mean, have you seen activity picking up toward the end of the year? Was there a particular situation that you faced this year that stands out as sort of some lessons learned?
Well, I think absolutely have seen increased activity. As I've told many firms, I mean, unless you have if you look at the Russia-Ukraine, unless you are directly attached to Ukraine, you're likely not to be impacted unless it's a crossfire. You inadvertently get a virus or malware that was intended for someone else. But we've absolutely seen an increase in the amount of phishing attempts. Part of what we've discovered is these conflicts have to be funded, and oftentimes the way it's funded is through kind of what Brian described is these attempts to take money from retirement accounts and other accounts. And so you have a number of these account takeovers, business email compromises where you compromise the account, send instructions to, as he mentioned, send it to a different routing account or funding account, destination account, and then funds are legally transferred to that location. And the involvement with the FBI, one of the things for all FAs to really understand is if something were to happen, you really need to get to them within 2 days, because after that, the likelihood of them being able to recover those funds drops significantly. So if you're going to involve law enforcement, you need to do it quickly if you want to hope to recover those funds.
You know, I'm glad you raised that because we had a fascinating conversation last week on this. We had our CNBC CFO Council event here in Washington, D.C., where I am. And we did a role-playing exercise where everybody got a chance to sort of go through a scenario in real time in which they'd been hacked and they had to face a lot of decisions as they went through the scenario. But the big decision for all of these firms was whether or not they pay the ransom in a ransomware attack scenario. And I was stunned that every single team playing in that role-playing game last week decided to pay the ransom. I'm old enough to remember in cybersecurity where that was sort of a controversial decision for firms to take. You didn't want to send money to a criminal organization because of the liability, criminal and otherwise, you might face yourself. Nowadays, though, it seems like the FBI has sort of backed off of its recommendation, or at least backed off of hammering home its recommendation not to pay, and firms more and more are paying. But Brian, I wonder, as you look at that and think about sending money directly to a criminal organization, how all of the red flags in terms of the regulatory environment surround that, I wonder what you're seeing. Are firms unanimously deciding to pay in these cases, and how do they handle the legality of sending money to crooks?
Well, we're fortunate that the firms that we're working with are taking a proactive approach and realizing that it's much less money to be proactive and spend the money up front than to pay any of those ransoms. A lot of firms have bought cyber insurance thinking that the cyber insurance will just cover ransomware and just pay out the claims and be able to protect them. But again, if they follow that guide that the Department of Labor has put together, it's exceptional. The regulators have done an exceptional job in defining how a firm can prevent a ransomware attack from happening in the first place. And that really has to be the approach. And if you follow that guide and follow what the regulators are asking and coming out and meeting in their exams and really helping firms, and that's really what their goal is, to help firms step up their proactive approach to cybersecurity so we don't have ransomware attacks.
Yeah, that's the place to start, right? Not having the attack. Once you get the attack, then you've got a whole other series of questions. And Greg, let me ask you a question which is coming in from the audience who are watching this. This is sort of the news you can use portion of the conversation. So a question from one of our audience members here is, have you seen an uptick in cyber attacks as more advisors and their staff are working remotely? That's the question from our audience member. I'd add to that also, how does that mix shift, the mix of danger shift, as we come back to sort of hybrid workforce? I know here at CNBC, we've got sort of a 3 days on, 2 days off arrangement for the most part for most people. So as people go to work from home and then come back in a hybrid universe, what are the cyber risks and rewards there, so to speak?
Yeah, one of the biggest things you see as people go home, when you're working in the office, you know that the internet service is secure. They're connecting to the network so you can download patches and make sure all the security stack that you've installed on their device is present and working. When you're working from home with Office 365 and other collaboration tools, office productivity tools that doesn't necessarily require you to log into VPN and connect to their network, oftentimes many of those security controls are no longer present, and it makes remote users somewhat more susceptible to network attacks and antivirus and malware attacks on their PC. And so it requires the security person to make sure they implement controls where you force the user to always be on VPN. And kind of one of the big bits of advice, and Brian touched on a little bit, that I would say you need to do is you need to make sure, one, I'd say make sure you hire a security person. Don't just get a network guy, IT person to help you and say, oh, they have security covered. Many times they don't. Though they have two different functions, and they can really help you make sure you have the proper controls in place that's appropriate for you. Best practice is best for that particular organization. A control that's best for one organization may not work for the next one. And that's the reason why it's important to have a qualified security professional evaluating your organization to make sure you have the proper controls in place and not necessarily compare yourself to others.
And Brian, let me ask you another question coming in from the audience here as they're watching this event today. The question is this: LastPass has been hit twice over the last couple of months. Is our industry doing enough to keep our clients' data safe? And for those who don't follow all this, LastPass is that password manager that encrypts all your passwords and helps you store them in one place. If they're getting hit, though, that's sort of the mother lode, right? That's where all the passwords are. So, Brian, how do you look at that when you see that kind of risk out there, and whether or not the industry is doing enough to keep client information safe?
So there are these best-of-breed applications like a LastPass that really fulfills on an important part of protecting those passwords. And LastPass actually has done that. In fact, they have a mature cybersecurity program where they announce that they're investigating a breach, and anybody can have a breach. The question is, for the people that are using LastPass, are they hardening their systems to make sure that when the bad actors do get in, that they don't get their information, using things like multi-factor authentication, using things that allow, and there's a tremendous amount of security controls that if they were in place, you can't just sign up for LastPass, use it, and expect to be safe. You have to sign up for LastPass, leverage a security professional to help harden that system to make sure that if there is an issue, that you have a plan in order to respond to it.
I want to get into this question that's on a lot of people's minds at the end of this year, which is cryptocurrency. We've seen this just sort of epic wipeout in crypto value over the past couple of months. And I wonder what both of you guys think about crypto and DeFi in terms of financial advisors generally, whether you think now is the time to get in, maybe in the classic example of buying low and hopefully at some point selling high, if now is the time to get in, and then what the cybersecurity implications are of being in the crypto markets, because we've seen not just hackers, but we've seen entire exchanges go down, freeze client funds. We've seen all kinds of shenanigans, I guess you could say, in the exchange space over the past couple of weeks. So I wonder how you think about the risks and rewards of crypto right now. Greg, why don't we start with you, and then I'll come back to Brian on that question.
Yeah, as it relates to whether or not a person should get in, I think that's individual financial advice, which
you're not going to give us individual
I don't want to get into providing.
Fair enough.
Yeah, but just in general, I mean, as it relates to the risk with investing, I mean, with protecting it, you get into really protecting your wallet. You've seen people not only cyber, but you also get into just normal hardware failure where the wallet's lost and access to the funds that you have invested is lost. I think there's less security when you start talking crypto simply because it's normally the wallet and is contained on a personal device. And any email, text message that you click on, someone can gain access to your personal device, compromise your wallet, and remove your funds. So it opens up to a pretty big risk. And there are a number of protections that you'd have to take in order to secure it.
Brian, how do you look at crypto right now?
I mean, whenever anybody comes out there and challenges the bad actors, the hackers, in order to make a claim that it's more secure, less secure, that's a challenge. So I think the bad actors and the hackers have made it very clear that from a crypto's perspective, they have the ability to hack into those systems. Now, again, those same fundamentals that we just talked about before, about hardening the systems, using multi-factor authentication, and using professionals to make sure that they can't get in order to steal those assets. Because when the crypto assets are stolen, certainly crypto has made it easier for the hacking community to get paid. And that's one of the challenges in crypto.
Yeah. And Brian, you brought this up before in terms of strategizing and having a plan to prevent getting hacked. One of my big takeaways from our CFO Council event just last week here in DC that I just mentioned was talk about those plans and the idea that a lot of firms have plans on the books, but if they don't drill those plans in a somewhat real world scenario, they don't ever find out sort of where the weak points are in the plan itself. So you might have something on a shelf somewhere that's ready to go in case you get an attack, and you say, okay, well, we've checked that box, we've got a plan. If there's an attack, I just go there and open the notebook to page 1 and start going. What these guys were saying last week was a lot of companies have a plan, yeah, but they haven't run that plan in anything close to a real world scenario. So they don't pick up on all the little things that are going to make it fail in the first couple of hours. And Brian, I wonder what you can say in terms of drilling on the plan. Do you see people doing that? Are we all doing that enough?
We're definitely not doing it enough, and that's where the guide, and we just talked about the guide that the DOL put out, but also the other regulators, FINRA, SEC. What they have in there is they not only do they have you appointing somebody responsible, but they also have you doing something called a risk assessment. And in that risk assessment, it's really a test of your program. An independent third party will come in and take a look at each area of your program, whether it's training, the hardening of other systems, the technical controls, the data controls, a lot of elements to a cyber program, all defined in that guide.
And Greg, the former Treasury Secretary, Tim Geithner, always had a saying he would use with us reporters. He would say, plan beats no plan. And I guess that's always the case, except if you haven't drilled the plan, right?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I recommend is you should do annual tabletop exercises. And I do those on an annual basis where we'll create a scenario. And it's normally, I'll have a person create it, and even I won't know what the scenario is. And we'll bring in not only people in different portions of the organization, and occasionally, a couple of years ago, I had the FBI come in and facilitate a tabletop exercise where no one knew what the plan was. And it's important to just run through the scenarios, walk through what you would do in the event of the various scenarios, and then go back and do a post-mortem where you review, okay, what answers didn't we have? Where were areas where we thought we could have performed better? And then there are also companies that offer service where they'll really bring in a consolidated plan. So not only do you have to deal with the technical portion of it, you have to deal with the communication. How do you involve legal? How do you involve your corporate communication? How do you involve working with the media? How do you involve dealing with insurance companies, law enforcement? And so you can really, it's best to plan it so when it happens, you have an idea of what to do. And the biggest area of failure that comes in is decision making. Oftentimes, the decision-making to declare emergency, to approve expenditure of funds is limited to one person. You have to think through that and start to push that responsibility down, because Murphy's Law says when something goes boom, that person won't be available, and you don't want to be standing there holding the bag, waiting to get a hold of someone to make a decision.
One company told us last week that they didn't realize that they didn't have ability to connect with each other without cell phones. So if your cell phone goes down, how do you call that person who's in charge of that aspect of the plan? Is there a hardline number? Do you have that written down on a piece of paper somewhere? Really basic stuff like that can really make your life a nightmare. We just got a couple more minutes here. Let me get to some more audience questions because I know those are important. Greg, let's give this one to you. Are offline hard drive backups still one of the best defenses against ransomware demand, or are online backup providers now well protected as well? Greg, what do you think?
Well, I think you have to specifically have a solution that's architect. You'll hear a term air-gapped. And essentially what that means is it's an offline backup, and you can do it with physical or you can do it with online. But if you're doing it online, you have to specifically request that service through whoever your provider is, AWS, Azure, GCP, Oracle. You have to specifically request that it's an air-gap backup and to get those protections because that's really the investment that you need to make to prevent ransomware. If you have a good backup, then even if you get impacted, you still have access to data, even though we have seen some malware destroy the actual infrastructure that it's on as well. So you need to take that into account. Not only do you want the data, but your application configurations and your infrastructure configurations, because oftentimes you may have to rebuild your entire network. And if you have something to back up from, it makes it a whole lot easier.